Looking back on my last couple of entries, I realised that I've to some extent been drawn towards big issues which have been discussed in our study group on the blackboard merely. Which, yes, they have a relationship to teaching and pedagogy and so on. But they're kind of large issues around the internet, and I just find myself drawn to these issues. I suppose it's because it's what I teach about, or some of the ideas that I discuss in my teaching and write about in my research. So I'm afraid this is another kind of big set of questions and ideas that I'm going to look at, but I do think all of these things have relevance to the specific contexts which we have discussed or been asked to talk about during the course. And I suppose I just kind of distill the things that appeal to me and that I think merit further exploration, even if they might not be about specific issues to do with e-learning or teaching per se. The one that I wanted to look at this time around is there was a notion that was touched upon a few times in terms of reaching out to larger publics. Say, for example, educational institutions are attempting to extend their reach onto the internet and get much broader and larger participation in university courses through offering courses online, for example. We looked at some courseware and cloud-based applications which give a slightly more open system than say the traditional closed VLE environment. Particularly Coursera, which has interestingly been in the news recently in terms of the difficulty of institutions assessing huge numbers of students who are enrolled upon these courses, and having to find ways of managing that, and perhaps introducing more kind of peer assessment and so on and so forth. So those are kind of practical issues to do with teaching and assessment that result from scaling up the classroom to kind of internet scale, to mass scale. And that kind of leads me on to some broader issues which I think are, have been pertinent through some of our discussions. We watched a video of a presentation by Clay Shirky talking about how he felt there were certain modes of social organisation that are enabled through the internet. It's a theme that he's tackled in numerous ways in his publications, like Here Comes Everybody, for example, a famous book that he wrote about that idea that the internet enables huge numbers of people to take part in activities, and how to manage that and how to deal with that, and what the implications of that phenomenon are. But I don't think the idea of large numbers of people participating or taking part in things is anything new. It's just that we've had a mass industrialised society for hundreds of years now. So the notion of the masses is quite an old one in a way, and it's interesting that technology thinkers are looking at that. Obviously, they're looking at it through the prism of the networks and the kind of individuated experience that digital networks give, and yet certain behaviours take part on a massive scale. So that those kinds of ideas around masses of people taking part or participating in particular activities seem quite relevant to delivering teaching across the internet. There's another thinker who's kind of pertinent here, and it would be Pierre Levy with his 1999 book Collective Intelligence, where he sets out this idealistic notion, in a way, of the internet as a bringing together of a huge global brain, if we like, that we can pool the resources of all the brain power of all the millions of individuals on Earth to help solve problems, to share knowledge and so on. And that's often the kind of way that the internet is seen, and the rhetoric that we hear about networks is often portrayed in those very positive terms, as a kind of egalitarian space where people take part in positive, rational projects for the betterment of humankind. But as we all know, it doesn't always work like that, and Shirky was, honest enough to show us some of the things that are frivolous about the internet, and this is, that's nothing new either. The idea of mass media is not new, and the idea of frivolous popular culture is not new. It just takes slightly different forms on the internet, and the forms that both of these thinkers try to articulate is, a kind of bottom-up model, an idea that culture springs from mass interaction rather than from a top-down centralised model, as in the era that has now passed. That again is perhaps a little disingenuous, because we have to face the fact that the networks are not neutral, that there are actors within those networks, the large corporations that control access to the networks, that control the servers where websites are hosted, that design the interaction frameworks on websites and social networks that people take part in. All of those things govern the way that people interact online. So there are a lot of problems with this kind of optimism and this idealism around the role of the internet in enabling large numbers of people to create positive experiences and progress human knowledge. Although one cannot deny that this is also a potential. One of the models that Shirky talked about was extrapolated from something that the open source and free software movement had developed, a version control system which allows a large number of programmers to work on different iterations, different forks as they call it in software development, of a larger piece of code, and he suggested that this would be a much more participatory and democratic way of, say, framing legislation to allow people to contribute and see those contributions tracked through a versioning system similar to that used by the GNU Linux software project. I think there are some issues around that, and has been noted by some of the fellow students, that participation from behind a screen on a discrete project is very different from the cut and thrust of debate face to face and discussion of issues and merits and demerits, and the kind of arguing that, as Shirky admits, is one of the strengths of how people communicate on the internet, that a diversity of voices can be heard and positions can be taken. You know, that is quite a different activity from, you know, mass participation in the editing or creating of something. You know, in a way one could say that Levy's creative intelligence, the kind of palpable expression of this idea, is something like Wikipedia, which is by turns brilliant and informative and detailed, and yet it has many flaws, it has many gaps in its knowledge, it has many controversies and many problems with its editing and the organisation of that editing, and editing wars on controversial topics. So I suppose my question would be, to finish on, would be, you know, is mass participation ever really possible? Is it not just an oxymoronic phrase? You know, what is the quality of participating in a mass activity as opposed to taking part in something in a smaller group or as an individual? You know, can the internet really get us away from the ways that crowds and masses behave, the kind of herd behaviour, the kind of following of stronger individuals, the so-called emergence of leaders in chaotic situations, which are not always positive experiences? Is the internet so special, so unique, that it can steer us away from that and make everything, you know, a kind of democratic heaven, a nirvana of perfect participation?